The stocks were a common form of public humiliation and mild torture used in medieval Europe. Individuals were immobilized in a wooden frame with holes for the hands and feet, rendering them completely restrained and exposed to the public. Though not intended to cause intense physical pain, the stocks were designed to humiliate and discomfort the victim. Forced to remain in this position for hours or even days, victims suffered from exposure to the elements, whether under the scorching sun, freezing rain, or snow. The long exposure often led to muscle cramps, swelling, sores, and, in extreme cases, permanent damage to the joints. The psychological torment of being the object of ridicule and scorn from onlookers also played a significant role in the suffering endured. The pillory was another public form of punishment that went beyond the stocks. Unlike the stocks, which immobilized the feet, the pillory restrained the head and hands, leaving the victim vulnerable to prolonged physical distress. The victim would be forced to stand still for hours, causing intense strain on the neck and spine, which led to severe cramping and muscle fatigue. What made the pillory more torturous was the active involvement of the public. Onlookers were encouraged to hurl insults, rotten food, stones, or even worse at the restrained person. This combination of physical pain and public humiliation often resulted in severe injuries and, in some cases, death from the abuse by the crowd. Water torture, also known as waterboarding, was a form of psychological and physical torment where water was dripped steadily onto a victim's face, usually their forehead. The victim was often bound to a chair, and the steady dripping would create an overwhelming sensation of drowning. While no lasting physical injury might occur, the victim would feel as though they were suffocating, triggering a fight-or-flight response. The constant dripping could drive the victim to mental exhaustion, and prolonged exposure could lead to panic attacks, severe anxiety, and eventually the breaking of the victim's will. This form of torture preys on the primal fear of drowning, making it a terrifying experience even though it might not cause direct physical harm. Finger torture was used to extract confessions or punish those who were accused of crimes. The victim's fingers were tied to a device that would either stretch them beyond their normal range or apply crushing pressure, leading to extreme pain in the bones, muscles, and joints. The gradual tightening or pulling could cause fractures, dislocations, and irreversible damage to the tendons, while the pain of crushed bones was nearly unbearable. Though not always fatal, the excruciating pain was often enough to force the victim into confession or submission. Unlike other methods that targeted the whole body, finger torture was focused on a smaller, more sensitive part of the body, causing localized but intense pain. The Scavangers Daughter was a method of torture devised during the reign of King Henry VIII, and it was specifically designed to contrast with the rack, which stretched the body. Instead of stretching, this device compressed the body into a painfully contorted position. The victim was forced into a crouching position, with their arms and legs bound tightly together by iron bands. The compression put immense pressure on the chest, organs, and limbs, leading to cracked ribs, internal bleeding, and severe muscle cramps. The lack of circulation caused by being forced into such an unnatural posture for prolonged periods resulted in further agony, and victims often passed out from the pain. Though not always fatal, the method was brutal, and many who endured it suffered long-term damage to their organs and nerves. The iron boot was designed to inflict excruciating pain upon the victim's feet and legs. The victim's foot would be placed inside a heavy iron casing, and screws would be used to gradually tighten the boot, causing immense pressure on the bones and soft tissue. As the device tightened, the victim's bones would begin to crack and fracture, while the tissue and ligaments would be damaged or crushed. In extreme cases, the foot could be completely crushed, rendering it useless. To add to the torture, boiling liquids such as molten lead or hot oil were sometimes poured into the boot, intensifying the pain with burns and blistering. This method was effective not only for punishment, but also for forcing confessions, as the agony was so severe that victims would often confess to anything simply to stop the pain. The rack is one of the most infamous torture devices in history, and for good reason. The victim was strapped to a large wooden frame with their wrists and ankles tied to rollers at either end. As the executioner turned the crank, the rollers slowly stretched the victim's limbs, pulling them in opposite directions. The process began with a discomforting stretching sensation, but soon escalated as muscles and ligaments were torn, and joints dislocated with sickening cracks. In some cases, the stretching continued until limbs were ripped from the body, or the victim died from the sheer trauma. The rack was often used to extract confessions, and the sight of others undergoing this brutal method often drove prisoners to break, confessing even to crimes they did not commit. The Iron Maiden was a gruesome device resembling a human-sized coffin, lined with sharp spikes. The victim was placed inside, and the device would then be closed, with the spikes puncturing the body in various places, causing slow bleeding and agonizing pain. Some victims would die from blood loss, shock, or internal damage caused by the spikes. What made the Iron Maiden particularly horrific was that it allowed the victim to experience prolonged suffering before death. The device was often used for public executions, adding to its terrifying reputation as a tool of both punishment and fear. The Pear of Anguish was a medieval device that could be inserted into a victim's mouth, genitals, or rectum. Once in place, the device would expand as a screw mechanism turned, causing excruciating pain and tearing the flesh. The sharp edges of the device would slice through skin, leading to severe bleeding and internal injuries. While the device wasn't always fatal, the suffering it caused was intense and debilitating. It was commonly used during the Spanish Inquisition to force confessions from those accused of blasphemy, heresy, or witchcraft. The physical and mental torment caused by the Pear of Anguish was one of the most gruesome aspects of medieval torture. Sawing was a method of execution and torture that involved suspending the victim upside down to keep blood flowing to the brain and prevent unconsciousness. The executioner would then use a large, serrated saw to cut the victim's body in half, often starting at the groin and working downward. The victim would remain conscious throughout the process, suffering through the agonizing pain as the saw worked its way through flesh and bone. The slow pace of sawing ensured that the victim would remain alive for as long as possible, prolonging their agony until death. The Brazen Bull was a horrific execution device used in ancient Greece, where the victim was placed inside a hollow bronze statue shaped like a bull. A fire would be lit beneath the bull, heating it to the point where the victim was roasted alive. The bull's design amplified the victim's screams, transforming them into eerie, animal-like bellowing sounds. The lack of oxygen and the intense heat made death slow and agonizing, ensuring that the victim would suffer as much as possible before succumbing to their injuries. Impalement was an execution method most famously used by Vlad the Impaler, where a long, sharpened stake was slowly inserted into the victim's body, typically through the rectum or genitals. The stake would gradually pierce the body, bypassing vital organs in an effort to prolong the suffering. Gravity would ensure that the victim would slide further down the stake, causing unimaginable pain and death. The torture could last for days as the victim's body slowly succumbed to shock, infection, or suffocation, making it one of the most prolonged and agonizing methods of execution. Scaphisim was an ancient Persian method of execution in which the victim was trapped in a hollowed-out boat, with only their head, hands, and feet exposed. They were force-fed milk and honey, which caused a massive, uncontrollable diarrhea. Left to float on stagnant water, the victim's exposed skin was eaten by insects and vermin, while the stagnant water caused infections and disease. This slow death was painful, prolonged, and drawn out, leading to extreme suffering that could last for days before the victim finally succumbed. Keelhauling was a brutal punishment used by sailors where the victim was tied to a rope and dragged beneath the hull of a ship. The rough, barnacle-covered surface would tear into the victim's skin, causing deep lacerations, infections, and severe blood loss. If the victim didn't drown, they often died from the wounds inflicted by the barnacles or from the shock of the experience. Keelhauling was a terrifying spectacle and served as a cruel reminder of the harsh conditions on ships in the age of piracy. Ancient times, some cultures used elephants to execute prisoners in a public spectacle. The victim would be tied to the ground or restrained, while the elephant was ordered to crush them with its massive feet. The elephant would stomp on the victim's chest or head with overwhelming force, often resulting in a slow, painful death as bones shattered and organs were crushed. This method was both a form of execution and a public display of power, with the spectacle designed to instill fear in the population. Rat torture, also known as rat in the cage, was a gruesome method where a cage filled with rats was placed over the victim's stomach or chest. The rats, often hungry, would be heated to force them to chew through the victim's flesh in an attempt to escape. The sensation of being chewed alive by the rats was agonizing, and the victim could die from shock, infection, or blood loss. This torture was used in various parts of Europe, and it was designed to make the victim suffer a slow and terrifying death. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was a brutal method of execution used throughout medieval Europe. The victim was tied to a large wooden wheel, and their limbs were broken using heavy iron bars. In some cases, the victim was left to die in agonizing pain, while others were given a mercy blow to end their suffering quickly. The broken body would often be displayed in public as a gruesome warning to others. Flaying was one of the most painful and horrifying methods of torture, where the victim's skin was slowly removed while they were still alive. The process was agonizing as the executioner peeled the skin off in strips, exposing the muscles, nerves, and blood vessels underneath. Many victims died from blood loss or shock, but the process could last for hours, ensuring the victim experienced maximum suffering. The Judas Cradle was a device used in medieval Europe where the victim would be placed on a pyramid-shaped seat. The point of the pyramid would be inserted into the victim's genitals, and their body weight would force them down, causing immense pain as they were impaled. The victim would be left to suffer for hours or even days, slowly succumbing to the trauma. This was one of the most gruesome methods of torture and execution.